7 years ago, I forcefully compelled you to marry me. After marriage, I faced the complete absence and disdain from my husband. Additionally, our family fell apart and ultimately I decided to let go. However, my husband suddenly lost his memory and, furthermore, returned to love me. My current state of mind is a mixture of happiness and sorrow because I know this emotional connection has a limited lifespan. Recently, I came across a news story that, in my opinion, gained considerable popularity. It has an exceptionally cute manhwa version, and it was through this manhwa that I discovered and started reading this series. The story revolves around a bottom character who was once a pampered young master, raised with a silver spoon in his mouth, showered with love by his father and older brother. One day, by chance, he encounters Lu Dao, and from the very first glance, he falls in love with this handsome young man, captivated by just a few gestures. However, being raised with the mindset of a young master who believes he can have anything he wants, he thinks love is no different. He believes that with money, power, and status, he can obtain the person he loves. But Lu Dao is a person, not an object, so no matter what he does, Lu Dao refuses to accept him. In the end, due to the coercion of Trin Can's father, the two still get married. They thought that, sooner or later, marriage would win over the heart of the one they loved. However, Trin Can could not anticipate that after 7 years of continuous affection, their relationship would still not improve. Therefore, Trin Can decides to let go. But just as he makes this decision, Lu Dao unexpectedly loses his memory, becoming the person that Trin Can always desired. This is a story with the angst tag, featuring a relatively mild level of emotional turmoil. Both characters have feelings for each other, but misunderstandings and complications lead to various events. Set in the future, the plot is quite clear as it falls under the category of adult content, HVAN, with a significant portion dedicated to steamy and intense scenes. However, the storyline is still emphasized and the author's writing is well crafted. The narrative doesn't heavily rely on dramatic plot twists, making the story a steady mix of explicit content and plot development. Some have commented on the bottom character having thoughts of infidelity, but from my perspective, it doesn't seem that way. The bottom character has been in love with the top one for 7 to 8 years, enduring years of emotional distance. Suddenly, the person in their heart becomes the one they've always desired. Despite the initial coldness, the husband starts showing affection and care, wrapping them in warmth for several months. The bottom character believes that once the top character recovers, they will revert to their original demeanor, causing inevitable regret. Despite feeling insignificant, they want to preserve some love from their husband as a memory for the future. In my opinion, this series is enjoyable with a mild angst factor. Initially, the bottom character may seem weak, but later on they prove otherwise, displaying vulnerability only in front of the top character and those who have hurt them. I appreciate this aspect, making it possible for me to read the entire story. The top character struggles to express emotions but genuinely cares for the bottom one, and though initially the dominance may seem harsh, it later appears justified. Fairy, who was standing nearby, lightly coughed and introduced Edward to Lucas. "This is your wife." He also introduced himself as Lucas' secretary Fairy, and the madam next to him was Lucas' only blood relative left in this world. Lucas himself was the youngest Grand Marshal in the Imperial planet's history. Therefore, now that Lucas had woken up, Fairy asked for permission to send the old madam to rest while Edward stayed behind to take care of Lucas. Before leaving, the old madam sternly warned Edward that he had better rein in his frivolous thoughts. After Lucas regained his memories, his facade would also be torn apart. She reminded Edward not to have wild fantasies. He gloomily agreed, "I understand, Grandma, please don't worry." And so Edward stayed by Lucas' side caring for him. Lucas silently observed, making Edward feel awkward. Edward clumsily asked if he was thirsty and wanted to drink. Lucas lightly smiled. As Edward handed Lucas the water, Lucas took the chance to grope him for a while, then elegantly drank the water, leaving Edward sighing as he watched. Even his drinking posture was as beautiful as before. Edward asked if he felt uncomfortable anywhere, and Lucas said he was fine, he just couldn't remember anything. After that, he even requested Edward to sit on his lap. Faced with this special request from Lucas, the pampered Edward was shocked but shyly sat on Lucas' lap. Lucas doted on his wife, asking if they were married. Edward softly admitted that they were married 7 years ago. That long ago? There was no way Lucas would have guessed it was so long. "Do we have kids?" Before Edward could reply, Lucas threw out a series of guesses, figuring they probably didn't since Fairy had said the old madam was his only living relative. "Then why did we get married 7 years ago but still have no kids?" Edward gloomily answered that there was no rush for now. Although Lucas had lost his memories, his keenness was still there. With one glance he knew Edward was lying. Why is there no rush? Hearing this, Edward panicked to find an excuse and ran off. You must be hungry, let me get you some food. And then Edward also ran away. He truly didn't have the courage to tell Lucas about their past and the silly things he had done. Upon hearing this, Edward was both embarrassed and surprised. Lucas explained that currently his limbs lacked strength. Edward understood and said, "Let me help you to the bathroom." Lucas took this opportunity to take advantage of his wife, placing Edward's hand in just the right spot. And so, Edward helped Lucas walk to the bathroom entrance, saying, "You go in, I'll wait out here." But how could Lucas let Edward get away? He said his arms lacked strength when really he was firmly grasping Edward's hand to keep him from leaving. Lucas then leaned in close to Edward and said he needed his help. Faced with Lucas teasing him like this, Edward bashfully stuttered, "That's enough." Thinking to himself that having such an adorable wife, Lucas wondered if he had ever failed to appreciate how cute Edward was when embarrassed. And so the two completed Lucas' bathroom trip with Edward helping Lucas back to the hospital bed. Edward hurriedly made an excuse to wash his hands out of shyness and awkwardly left. Hearing this, Lucas was surprised that Edward was not staying. Edward reminded Lucas that if he needed anything or felt uncomfortable, press the button to call the nurse. And if he wanted to contact anyone, check the screen interface. Lucas glanced at the contacts on the screen and was surprised his wife was not the priority one. Hearing this, Edward awkwardly laughed it off. "In the past, you were very busy and we often didn't keep in touch." Then Edward hastily ran off. But before he could get away, Lucas reached out to stop him, asking no goodbye kiss. Edward was also very surprised by this. Lucas explained that he had looked up how married couples behave and that before parting they give their partner a goodbye kiss. Edward was both embarrassed and moved. And so the two shared an intimate kiss. Edward was the first to start, but then Lucas put his arms around Edward's neck and became the one to take the initiative. The two shared a very passionate kiss. After the end, teased to the point of blushing, Edward hurriedly ran off. It wasn't that he disliked it, just that he wasn't used to it. Edward was increasingly unable to restrain himself from being emotionally swayed by Lucas even while clearly knowing that fact. Edward left because he was used to Lucas being cold before he lost his memory, so cold that 2 years ago, after Edward's family went bankrupt, Edward did not dare to ask Lucas for help but chose to shoulder it himself. He went to a fashion garment basement and applied for an apprenticeship there. The manager of this place is Andy, looking like he probably can't do this job. He said he heard that your husband Lucas' status was very high, so why didn't he ask his husband for help? But Edward just silently turned away because if Lucas knew about it, he was afraid he would applaud him and even divorce him. But Edward doesn't want to leave Lucas, so at all costs he must overcome this wave on his own. He earnestly wished to become an apprentice. Andy also agreed to teach him. Edward studied very hard, sometimes even focusing on sticking needles into his hands. At times like that, Andy scolded him, insisting that if he worked with real clothes, he couldn't let it bleed, otherwise it would stick to the fabric and ruin it. The next day and the day after that, every day Edward practiced sewing diligently. On the 5th day, he completed the first product, brought it to Andy, and received money he made for the first time in his life. Edward held the check in his hand, suddenly thinking about Lucas. "You've tried so hard to change yourself, I don't know if Lucas will change his view of you or not." Edward brought the soup over, wondering if he would like it. Right then, Yaoi opened the door, stunning Edward with his beauty. It was only when Lucas lightly coughed that Edward came to his senses and apologized for his impoliteness. Hearing this, Yaoi lightly laughed it off, saying it was fine. He introduced himself as Yaoi, subordinate and most outstanding collaborator of Grand Marshal Lucas Peach. He said it was fortunate Lucas had saved him, otherwise he would not have made it back. Unfortunately, Lucas currently could not even recognize him. Hearing this, the curious Edward asked if Lucas had saved him. Yaoi happily admitted this and recounted how due to carelessness he had failed to notice the approaching Zerglings. If not for Lucas' detection, he may not have lived to stand there today. A sour feeling arose in Edward's heart. The undefeated battlefield general Yaoi, Lucas' well-matched collaborator, was known as the twin black gods in rumors. Just as Yaoi was about to ask something, Edward jumped in to confirm, "You are Yaoi of the prestigious native Sui family, right?" Yaoi admitted this was correct. It could be said the Sui family was the most illustrious native family at the head of the imperial planet, enjoying excellent social rights and privileges. Edward himself had also met many from this family before. They were all born fighters of sharp instinct. Regaining his spirits, Edward politely smiled and introduced himself. I am Edward Chen, Lucas Peach's wife. Yaoi also guessed as much. He turned to tease Lucas for talking with Edward so long that Lucas was growing impatient. Hearing this, Edward hurriedly rushed over to ask if he had waited long. The vinegar-eating Lucas sulked that he had waited a long time. After that, he even blamed Edward, saying he had come early in the morning only for someone else to show up instead of Edward. Lucas also asked about the soup Edward had mentioned earlier. Standing to the side, Yaoi wondered if Lucas would reveal such an expression, the two flaunting their affection right in front of him. Suddenly remembering Yaoi was still present, Edward asked if he wanted to drink the soup. Getting a bad idea, Yaoi brightly smiled and said, "It would be my honor to taste the soup you made. Please give me a bowl." In another development, seeing the two so happy, Lucas Peach became jealous. Lucas Peach and Yaoi both tasted Edward Chen's soup and ended up praising it as delicious. Hearing this, Edward was bashfully asked if it was really good. Lucas Peach generously nodded. Yaoi also finished his bowl of soup, set it down, and took his leave. Before departing, he teased the difficult Lucas Peach, telling Edward Chen that although the Grand Marshal currently had amnesia, he was much more lovable now than before. Yaoi also asked if he could come visit when Lucas Peach was discharged from the hospital. Edward Chen agreed, and so Yaoi elegantly took his leave. Only after he left did Lucas Peach jealousy ask why Edward Chen had agreed. Was it because he wanted to cheat? Hearing this, Edward dropped the spoon in a panic, saying no, the one Yaoi cared for was Lucas. After that, Lucas Peach and Edward Chen argued for a while over the topic of cheating. Finally, Lucas Peach calmed down, saying his current knowledge was very little and he needed to study. Edward Chen wondered why Lucas would look into such things. Lucas asked if Edward could teach him, then reached out to pull Edward Chen close with flirtatious words. Hearing this, Edward Chen blushed even more. 1 week later, Lucas Peach was finally discharged from the hospital. Edward Chen brought him to the place where he lived, introducing that this was the home the government had allocated them after their marriage. He added that later when Lucas got promoted, they could get a free housing expansion once. While Lucas Peach walked ahead, Fairy behind told Edward Chen that actually 3 months ago the Grand Marshal had asked Fairy to order a private car. The car had arrived 10 days prior, but because the Grand Marshal did not say who it was for, Fairy did not know what to do with it. Therefore, he decided to keep the car at this house for now. Hearing this, Edward Chen was surprised and his heart complexly asked if Fairy had any guesses who it was for. The Fairy also did not know. Finally, Edward Chen stepped into the house full of worries, seeing Lucas Peach playing with Edward Chen. Lucas Peach had a vague memory, asking Edward Chen if this was Edward Chen. Edward affirmed it was. Now Edward Chen was like a cheerful little tail, busily tidying up things with joy. Edward Chen explained this name had been given by the previous owner. Lucas Peach was a bit confused, so Edward explained it was a wedding gift from his older brother. Lucas Peach asked if it was very lively. Hearing this, Edward laughed and replied that it liked beautiful men and would talk a lot upon seeing them. Lucas Peach leaned in close to Edward Chen, teasing whether he was praising Lucas as handsome. Edward admitted Lucas was very handsome. Right then, Edward Chen had finished tidying up the luggage, breaking up the intimate scene between the two people. It announced that the rooms for the master and young master had also been all set up, inviting them to follow it. Lucas Peach immediately questioned why there were separate bedrooms. Lucas Peach questioned Edward Chen, asking if he did not want to sleep together. Edward said his sleeping habits were not good, afraid of bothering Lucas, so he separated the rooms. Lucas remained suspicious. Edward explained he liked to kick in his sleep, grind his teeth, and even snore. Used to sleeping alone, it would be hard to change. But Lucas insisted on sleeping together. No matter what, he would not mind. The very embarrassed Edward finally hugged Lucas to compromise. How could he not agree when this was what he had desperately longed for? And so the two entered the bedroom. Lucas said it really matched what he had imagined, giving him a very comfortable feeling. Lucas was curious about an item in the room, asking if this was a vase. Edward Chen explained by his side that it was a small container he had knitted himself. He recalled there used to be a gemstone, but he had sold it to buy medicine for his father. Edward added in a hurry that if Lucas needed a scarf, he could also knit one. The more Lucas thought about it, the more he overflowed with love. He generously praised what an amazing wife he had, that Edward was so skilled. Nowadays there were very few handcrafted items. Finally, Lucas stepped forward, bent down, and kissed Edward's cheek. Edward was still shy, saying it was just a simple thing. Now the two were stuck close together. Lucas lifted Edward Chen's face, his possessive gaze asking if they had never done it before. Embarrassed, Edward admitted of course they had done it before. But seeing Edward's awkward expression, Lucas teased asking if he was afraid. However, Edward bravely put his arms around Lucas' shoulders, deeply kissing him and saying he was not afraid. He thought to himself the worst case had already happened. The person he loved did not love him back and even hated him. What more did he have left to fear? Lucas felt itchy inside from Edward's actions and had to admit there was definitely experience involved. It felt very familiar and intimate. In a small voice, Edward said in the end Lucas was still his husband. Hearing this, Lucas carried Edward up, arrogantly saying if that was so, it was time for Edward to fulfill his wifely duties. He pressed Edward down on the bed, preparing for a scene not fit for children's eyes. Suddenly, Edward remembered something. Wait. His right hand also took out contraceptives from the drawer to avoid pregnancy. Lucas was extremely surprised. Weren't they already married? He guessed this was why after 7 years they still had no children. Edward said in a low voice that he felt they were still young, so there was no rush. Lucas questioned unhappily, surely Edward must not love him enough. Edward sadly said no, there was no one who loved Lucas more than him. After that, the two embraced without another word. After a while, Lucas whispered into Edward Chen's ear, asking if he was ready. Lucas happened to have 8 months of vacation time. Why not try having a child, he suggested. Hearing Lucas want to have a child, Edward was overjoyed. He also talked about having children with Lucas. Seeing Lucas's interest in having kids, Edward was very happy, but in his heart there was still some gloom. The reason why Lucas said that was because he currently had amnesia. When he regained his memories, he might feel that Edward had used all sorts of tricks to seduce him. If Edward got pregnant, it would only increase the pain for an innocent life. Edward smiled and said to wait a bit longer until he grew up more and would not be afraid. By then Lucas could have as many as he wanted. Hearing this, Lucas also agreed. But they still had to do the indecent thing that children should not watch. The two whispered about positions. The embarrassed Edward wanted to turn off the lights, but Lucas frowned, arrogantly wanting the lights on. He complained about not letting him see Edward's face. Edward said Lucas did not want that before. The more Lucas heard, the more he blamed his past self for being so pathetic. Edward hurriedly said it was not like that. Right then, Lucas also carried Edward up, solemnly saying from today onwards every time he would want to see Edward very clearly. Edward happily agreed. And so the two did that embarrassing thing. After a while, when Lucas went to take a shower, Edward secretly went online to buy contraceptives. On this planet, abortion was illegal. Although it cost at least 15,000 points to buy, Edward could not get pregnant. After clicking purchase, Lucas had just stepped out of the bathroom. He caringly asked if Edward was tired and wanted to sleep yet. Edward shyly shook his head. Then he snuggled into Lucas's arms, whispering that he wanted to chat with Lucas a bit longer. Lucas tenderly looked at Edward. He suddenly wanted to know how they had first met. Hearing Lucas's question, Edward was flustered. He said to wait a few more months until Lucas recovered his memories and he would be able to recall everything. But Lucas arrogantly said he wanted to know their story right now. Edward compromised and recounted that 8 years ago Lucas had been a student at the Military Command Academy while Edward was just an ordinary high school student. He explained that although the command was strictly managed, the students got a few days every month to relax. Outside students could also come visit. At that time, Edward's friend had brought him when the school happened to be hosting a basketball match. Lucas had been on the team. Everyone was praising Lucas, so Edward became a bit curious. Edward borrowed his friend's binoculars and by chance saw Lucas's figure immediately falling for him. Hearing this, Lucas laughed and pinched Edward's cheek, teasing him for love at first sight. He joked if afterwards Edward had taken the initiative to pursue him, and Lucas agreed. The two then fell in love and got married right after graduation. No? The embarrassed Edward asked why Lucas thought so. Lucas breezily praised how adorable he was, flustering Edward even more. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Could the story not have developed that way? Edward bitterly recounted the truth. At first Lucas had rejected Edward, perhaps because he still saw Edward as too young. Later, although Lucas agreed when Edward confessed multiple times, in reality it was because Edward had taken advantage when Lucas's grandmother was having surgery. He deliberately canceled Lucas's painstakingly arranged schedule to force Lucas to marry him. And so Lucas had missed the surgery time window and the operation did not succeed, leaving his grandmother only able to use a wheelchair. Moreover, although Lucas upheld the agreement, the day after their wedding he went out to the battlefield and rarely returned home. Only now did Edward realize his mistake, but there was no way to make up for it. Seeing this, Lucas beside asked if Edward still held resentment. Edward said no, but Lucas had already moved closer. He wiped away Edward's red-rimmed eyes and scolded him for always liking to cry. Then he leaned in to whisper flirtatiously in Edward's ear if crying was to get Lucas aroused again. Hearing this, the embarrassed Edward reminded that this was already the third time. But enticed by Lucas's sweet words, the two proceeded into another scene not fit for children's eyes. It wasn't until late morning the next day that Edward finally woke up and asked Lucas if there were guests. Lucas admitted they were colleagues who had come to visit. Now Edward noticed honeydew melon on the table. Lucas doted on him and asked if he liked it, but Edward had already quickly peeled it, wanting Lucas to try some first. Then he asked if it tasted good. Lucas also took the chance to engulf Edward's fingertip, teasing him and flustering Edward. After, Edward asked if he could take some for his father, since his father also liked to eat it. After the surgery, his father had not gotten to eat any yet. Hearing this, Lucas was extremely delighted and agreed. He also wanted to go with Edward to visit his father. But Edward became scared upon hearing this. Lucas gently said it was propriety and that he also had the duty to visit his father-in-law. Yet Edward refused. It would be fine for just Edward to go while Lucas rested at home. Seeing Edward avoiding him, Lucas became even more determined to go. He even suspiciously asked if the one Edward was going to see was not his father but an ex-boyfriend. As Edward Chin hurriedly denied it wasn't like that, they still ended up going together. Seeing a car that suited his aesthetic taste in front of him, Edward couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, though there was also a tinge of sourness in his heart because it wasn't for him. Lucas Peach saw him and went over to take the item from his hands, saying let's go. The two got into the car, and on the ride Edward explained the sights they passed to help Lucas understand. Seeing him explain so attentively, Lucas couldn't help teasingly hugging his slender waist, saying you're so knowledgeable. But Edward humbly said it was nothing much. After a while, they soon arrived at the hospital. This hospital didn't look bad at all. After all, the fees were very expensive. Meanwhile, Edward's father Sidney Tsai was sitting on a hospital bed reading. Hearing Edward call out Dad, made Sidney look over. He also responded Little Chin. Edward happily said Lucas also came to visit. Looking at the person in front of him, although he didn't have any memories, Lucas somehow felt an inexplicable sense of dislike towards Sidney. So he guessed they didn't have a good relationship before. Indeed, Lucas was very embarrassed that he couldn't even get the words out. Edward helpfully said at his side that he doesn't need to call him Dad, before Lucas always called him Mr. Tsai. After looking Lucas up and down, Sidney sighed that he really lost his memory, otherwise he wouldn't have come to visit. Edward hurried to Sidney's side to ask about his health. He said he was fine, but felt more pity for his son, afraid he wasn't eating properly and had become thinner. Edward happily said he was eating enough and had even Gidney also seemed to have something he wanted to say to Lucas, so he made an excuse for Edward to go out and get water while he and Lucas could talk alone. Of course, Lucas realized Sidney was speaking directly. Sidney said he hopes Lucas will take good care of Edward. After all, it's been 7 years since they last met. When the Tsai family ran into trouble, Lucas didn't pay attention. Hearing this, Lucas just laughed and said he couldn't help it. He had investigated and it was a serious incident. No one was injured or died, so the Tsai family avoided going to jail. Listening to this, Sidney closed his eyes regretfully. But it was in the past. Now he only hoped Lucas would take good care of Edward because his son loved him very much. Of course, Lucas agreed, but what Sidney wanted as not now but after getting his memories back. Lucas was a bit embarrassed. With his temperament, if he found out there was something wrong with Edward, he didn't understand why he would be scared. When Edward Chin and Lucas Peach got home, Edward was worried Lucas would be tired from visiting the hospital, so he told his husband to rest first while he finished sewing a dress in his home office before going to sleep. Lucas was curious and Edward honestly shared that sewing was his hobby and also a way to earn a little extra money. Edward reassured Lucas that he would finish quickly and then be with him. Lucas jokingly offered Edward money since he had ample savings, but Edward refused, saying he wanted to handle things himself using his own skills. This made Lucas a little unhappy. Why refuse when they were married and could share finances? But Edward insisted, saying he would rely on Lucas if he really struggled. For now, he wanted independence. They compromised that Lucas would stay and read in the same room. Each became lost in their own thoughts as they worked. After 2 hours of highly focused work, Edward finished the dress and excitedly showed it off to Lucas, asking if he thought it was pretty. Lucas affectionately agreed it was beautiful and asked if Edward was done with his work yet. Edward's expression grew serious, realizing there was no rush since Lucas would regain his memories once the poison was gone. Edward turned and held up the new dress he made, asking Lucas what he thought. Lucas kindly praised Edward's hard work and asked if the actress in the adult video he was watching on-screen could endure as much as Edward could. He implied wanting to test Edward's endurance while also reminding him about having a baby one day.